Hey everybody, this is Matt here again with another opening. This is another Queen's Gambit decline line called the Semi-Slav. As we saw with the Slavs, it's just another pawn support on the d5 pawn, and we'll get into it right away. So it starts out with Queen's Gambit, which is d4, d5, and c4. We saw with the Slav that Black wanted to play pawn to c6 to support this pawn on c5. But in the Semi-Slav, we're actually going to see, and also in the Slav, one of the main things is to try to get the bishop out to this square before moving this pawn up. But in the Semi-Slav, we actually see pawn to e6 immediately, rather than pawn to c6. And so right away, Black has already said, you know what, I'm going to let this bishop be trapped for a while. In return, I'm not going to have any kind of weaknesses. Normally, f7 is a weakness for the Black position, but as you can see, we've just made this blockade preventing any kind of diagonal attack on f7, which is the main way to exploit the weakness. And so this is no longer going to be a weakness for Black, and now the weakness is going to be the bishop not being able to be utilized in the early game. But besides that, it's very solid. There's no other real weaknesses in the position, and so it's a very good opening, and we're going to jump right in. The Slav is defined by after this, not to c3, not to f6, not to f3, excuse me, and now we see pawn to c6, and this is the Slav defense. The variations are going to come out of this position right here, and the first variation I want to talk to you about is the Moran Variation, very common variation, and it goes with White playing pawn to e3, just trying to easily recapture this pawn if Black decides to capture. Moving this pawn up makes it so that we do not have to move the a pawn up to a4 to guard this square any longer, and so it is no longer in Black's interest to capture this pawn until we move the bishop, say, to this square, so that we would then have to move it a second time to get to the c4 square to recapture, which will essentially make White lose a turn. So Black's just going to wait until until they see the bishop move the first time to try so that White can then potentially castle on the king side. One thing you might see, and one thing to keep in mind is just because this is the main line does not mean you're going to see that. One of the most important things you can remember when you're learning openings is that yes, the main lines will happen pretty often, the higher level play you go into. But not everybody knows the main lines, or not everybody wants to follow the main lines. So if you see a variation that is not a mainline variation, just play with what your opponent does and play accordingly. For example, if right now your opponent were to capture this pawn on c4, that's perfectly fine. I mean, now you just recapture with the bishop and you just play from there. There's no problems with that. So don't think that if your opponent doesn't play the line perfectly to what the main line is, that the opening's ruined. You just need to think what is your best option from there if they do not follow the main line that you have learned. So play continues with Black playing not b to d7. You see this pawn structure again in Karl Khan, the Scandinavian, and the Slav, and it's again because this pawn is taking up the knight's ideal square, and so this is a very good square to develop the knight. After this, you'll see play continue with White playing the bishop to d3 in this variation. And as we were talking about, Black will now capture so that White has to move a second time, and now it is Black's turn. So Black gained a tempo in a way on White. Play continues from here with the pawn coming up to b5, attacking the bishop, making the bishop move a third time, and White will normally play it back to d3. Although e2 is an option, it's just much more passive on that square. And this is the main line of the Moran variation of the Semi-Slav. as you can see, white lost some tempo. They had to move the bishop 3 times. They had to move it once to develop it so that they could castle, move it a second time to capture, and a third time when black attacked it with the b5 pawn. And some players don't like that. Some players don't want to have to lose that tempo with their bishop. And so there's another variation. Let me get back to the Semi-Slav right here. And it'll go like this. The pawn still comes up to e3. The knight on b will still come to d7. But rather than moving the bishop, white can play what's called a in-between move or a waiting move. It's just where white makes a move that isn't necessary, but it's still a good move, and it can kind of just like make black take their turn. And in this case, that move is queen to c2. This way, it's kind of seeing if black is just going to go ahead and take this pawn, so the bishop takes one trip to get the pawn. If black takes the pawn, which you will see, just recapture with the bishop. Again, they are going to bring this pawn to b5, gaining a tempo, but it will not be as big as a tempo as it would have been previously, where you moved your bishop 3 times. There's also the option where black decides that they don't want to capture your pawn until you move your bishop, so they're just going to do their own in-between move. The main line of this line actually is to move the bishop to d6. I really personally don't like bishop to d6 simply because pawn to c5 in the future could gain a tempo on the bishop. So I personally don't like playing it to d6. I prefer playing it to e7 so that the pawn can't gain a tempo, but that does take away the benefit of moving the bishop back to a square such as c7. So there's that. It's really up to preference. And from here, you can do 2 things as white. You can do 3 things actually, excuse me. You can now move your bishop, and it'll pretty much transpose into the Moran variation that we just went over. Only you'll have your queen there, which is basically going a turn ahead of the last variation. Another option you can do is you can develop your bishop to d2. It's another in-between move, just kind of waiting. What are you going to do, black? However, if you see black move this bishop here, you're probably going to see black go ahead and castle. So this in-between move is not going to make black want to capture your pawn any more than they did before. Your other option is a very famous gambit for this line. It's called the Shrove Shabal Gambit. It's seen a lot in top play, and it's a very successful gambit. Top grandmasters use this gambit when given the opportunity quite often. And it's if you play queen to b2, c2, and black does not capture the pawn. Instead, they play their own in-between move, and it's simply pawn to g4. And it's offering this pawn up as a sacrifice. As you can see, the knight can take this pawn, or other pieces later in the game. This pawn is kind of out in the open. And what it's going to do is, whether this knight takes it or whether you just push this pawn up until something captures it, what it's doing is opening up this file for your rooks to play on later in the game. Obviously, after you do this, you are going to castle on the king side, on the queen side, so that you can stack your rooks on these files, or maybe push this pawn to open up this file as well. Because black can already castle on the king side, and it will be quite difficult for black to castle on the queen side at this point. First, the queen will have to move, and then a knight or the pawn will have to move so that the bishop can move, so that the king can castle on the queen side. And the queen side pawn structure has already been damaged slightly by this pawn advanced to c6. So more than likely you will see black castle on the king side, and if you do not, you will know well in advance that they've decided not to, and you can begin to shift your pieces and your momentum and your attack over to the queen side short after. You won't always see your opponent take it, as was stated earlier. If the knight does not take this pawn, then you can just push this pawn up, and eventually this pawn's going to get captured, or you can capture something, and you're going to open up some files for your rooks to be able to attack the king side. And it's a very strong attack. I recommend that you try it, especially if you're an aggressive player. It is a really aggressive line. And even if you're not an aggressive player, it opens up some very nice lines to play with. Me personally, I think it's a very fun variation to go into when playing as either white or black. Another variation that you can see is the Cambridge Spring Defense. Get back to the Semi-Slav. The Cambridge Spring Defense, now, rather than playing pawn to e3 like the other variations, you will now see bishop to g5. And the idea behind this is that playing pawn to e3 first traps your traps your dark squared bishop, as does the light squared bishop for black. So this variation is focusing on trying to make the bishop more useful in the opening and early stages of the game, rather than just have it be very passive over here on the back rank or maybe on the second rank. From here you'll see the knight still develop to b7. That way, if this knight is captured, black can just recapture with their knight and no loss of position is placed. And it allows this queen to still be able to come out on this diagonal, which is why they don't want to capture this knight with the queen. From here, you'll see pawn to e3 now that the bishop is out. And then in the Cambridge Spring Defense, you'll see queen to a5, just starting to put a lot of pressure on the white position, getting the queen involved in the game quite early on. This is quite an aggressive line for black, and so if you're not an aggressive player, there is an alternative that I'm about to go over as well. And the only difference in the alternative is, instead of this queen to a5, it's just simply bishop to e7, breaking the pin, and that is called the Orthodox Defense. From there, you'll also see another variation besides the bishop is just moving this pawn up, trying to put a question to the bishop on g5 as to whether they're going to maintain the pin or back it down one, or what exactly white intends to do. The last main variation that you'll see very commonly in the Semi-Slav is the Moscow variation. It's the only variation that actually has a different setup initially. It's still the Queen's Gambit with the pawn to e6, and we'll still see the knight to c3 and the knight to f6 and the knight to f3, but rather than moving this pawn to c6, we're going to see the knight develop to c6, and this is called the Moscow variation. From here, you'll typically see the bishop still come to g5, excuse me, and from black you will now see the pawn immediately come up, just trying to knock this bishop either back or to capture the bishop so the queen can capture the knight so the queen can recapture and maintain the center control that the knight is trying to hold down right now. And in this situation, white does not want to back the bishop up, simply because it's a loss of tempo. So you generally, in this variation, you're going to see white capture the bishop, the queen recapture, and this is the end of the main line for the Moscow variation. It's a slightly more aggressive variation, but these are the main lines of the Semi-Slav. It's a very solid defense. It's a great opening for both sides. I recommend that you try it and use it. It's used very much in high-level play. So I hope you got something out of the video. Subscribe, comment. Thanks for watching.